We're gonna want to clap at the same time.
Let's try it.
Okay.
All right.
3.
1,
Oh.
2.
1.
No, wait. Wait. Go ahead.
3, 2, 1. Clap. Okay.
Yeah, looks good to me.
All right, Francis. Let's talk about feminism and film, and what has changed in the last 20 years and what has stayed the same. I read your interview in Women of Vision: Histories in Feminist Film and Video that was published in 2001, and I found some interesting quotes there. In your interview, you said, "I relate to feminist work and I incorporate feminist concerns into my work, but as an identity, it tends to exclude other concerns that have to do with migration, for instance, my diasporic sensibility, and being located at the intersections of power relations." So can you give me a little bit of context around that resistance, around that reluctance to identify wholeheartedly as a feminist at that time?
Sure. I think the context is that I'm a recent migrant to the United States. I had been in Puerto Rico participating in feminist queer groups. And when I arrived in the US, what I encounter is that the feminist narrative that's most available and most institutionalized in academia, in the political sphere, in public culture, is one hegemonized by middle class white women who don't tend to center these other concerns that I had then and still have now. Another reason is that I think more generally, this was a period where I was very much pushing against being categorized by identities in these discrete and separated ways. So you were a Puerto Rican, or you were a lesbian, or you were a feminist, and that seemed very constraining. And I think and then the third context I would put it in, I was devoting a lot more time to queer filmmaking and queer activism, queer scholarship, and I feel to some extent because at that time it was so much less institutionalized. These practices were so much less institutionalized. In the US, encountering feminism as an institutionalized, to some extent greatly institutionalized, particularly through the academy, gave me that sense that this was more of a canonical process. Like you had to master, in a way, the history, the figures, the issues, and that's a totally different relationship. In time, because that's not something that I necessarily was taught, I feel, in academia. But in time, I came to give tremendous importance to method.
And Alex, actually, she emphasized the initial quote I read about you being reluctant to identify as a feminist, and she emphasized it in her introduction, and she wrote that such critiques of, quote, feminism's myopia, of the false limits and boundaries it often builds, have been foundational to the shape and method of this project. So already you're starting to see that the act of forming a sort of methodology around knowledge production that I think Alex was also aware of at the time, and building her own history of feminist film. What method she was using and how she wanted to go about it was very much central to the work. And so I kind of wanted to shift our thinking in method and sort of talk about the method that we use in the Media and Idea Lab, and just kind of the story of our work there.
Conceptually, the lab came about when I was doing these 18-hour days, working at the university and then going home till midnight to edit projects. And it came to a point where I thought it was just unsustainable, that I needed to create a space at work that I could also do my film work, right? And the solution that the university and I came up with was that I could hire a student as what we called a digital assistant to work with me in the lab. So this was a paid position for a student. It would be a space to produce film in a very different environment than the school does. It was to be a space that also conducted research into media, a space to produce a certain kind of work in a certain way, not done by the rest of the university.
And that method could be called feminist, and it could be said to employ feminist pedagogy. And yeah, I'm just interested in talking to you kind of about the story of how that method has worked in us and transformed us these past 4 years.
Well, I think the assumptions of the lab is that everyone knows something. Therefore, this is not going to create a hierarchical relationship between the one that presumably knows and the one that doesn't know, but create an environment that we are co-learning and exchanging skill sets and perspectives as a fundamental of how we produce knowledge in this space. The fact that I might have 30 years of experience doing this work doesn't make it any less daunting of a challenge. You know, when you're making a film and you're not making the same thing that you just did, you're confronting a brand new challenge, a brand new question that you might be ill-equipped to handle. And for instance, in our relationship, what I saw in you that was incredible for me is that you had a talent even before we went through 4 years of working together to relate poetically images and sounds. And that was the perfect skill set and perspective and approach to filmmaking that was necessary to make Paraíso, which is the film that we've been working mostly for the last 4 years.
Una vez y dos hombres en el paraíso.
I'm starting to feel that the making of the film is almost its own story, you know, with its own character arcs and trajectories and revelations. Like, I remember, you know, I saw that footage for the first time my freshman year, and it was really just like hey, you look at this sometime. I knew that it was something that a project I had fallen in love with, and I wanted to be able to rise to the occasion, but at the same time, I think it was very daunting.
One of the reasons that it was terrifying is that I actually chose a very different method to work on this film than any other film that I ever made. These were my home movies that I shot myself as a child. And I had throughout my adult life felt intuitively, mysteriously, that they were a sort of treasure that had something to tell me at the right time. So when I said, check this out, it was getting to be that right time that I feel it's time to open the box and see what it has to say. And as you remember, we spent a long time, probably a year, at least a year, just looking at it and seeing what is it that this footage is about. And once we started, and it was a very interesting process because for a long time I was terrified because I thought there's no story, there's no movie here, there's nothing here. But then it was almost like overnight that I started to see things and hear things. And then that's where we start connecting them. Yet, every time we tried to impose a narrative on it, it was very stubborn and very resistant. It didn't want it. So then it almost was like telling us, look closer, dig deeper. And that's what we've been doing. And in the process, I feel that one of the impacts or the effects of it is that we've had so many challenges, but every time we come with a way to address it, and every time we come with a way to address it and make it richer, we also gain in confidence, if you will. And that's another intangible, I guess, of the lab experience, that because we're not afraid of the questions and we're not afraid of not knowing and not afraid of the challenges, therefore, you become less afraid in general as a person, as a human, as an artist.
I like to describe the space. It was a dangerous, safe space to explore. You stop taking those holes of knowledge as proof that you can't be a filmmaker, and you start realizing that's actually part of being a filmmaker. That constitutes it.
And I think part of the lab experience is also to see that even someone who is a professional, someone who has been working for a long time, can also be still learning and still challenged and still in need of collaboration with all kinds of people, including young people. And it's interesting, something we didn't talk about, how when we face challenges in our process,
Oh yeah.
we're also sending each other references of films.
Yeah, that's true.
Check this film out. And sometimes, somebody will tell me, what are you doing? And I'm saying, Betta gave me homework.
I remember the joy actually freshman year when you gave me 5 films to watch to start thinking about Paraíso. There was a Chantal Ackerman film, Sue Frederick, who was actually in the original interview for this event, and it was Alina Marazzi, and it was all of these filming. I just remember taking that weekend and watching all of those films, and just I spent hours writing things about them, because in a sense it was the first time I had ever really seen that you could make movies like that you could make a movie that is sort of memoir, and that you could make a movie about your family that incorporates family footage. I just didn't even consider that the stuff of movies from the tradition that I was exposed to growing up. When I encountered it, I felt that there was something right there for me as a filmmaker.
And I think the other part has to do with that we enjoy working this way. So a big part of creating the space is that when you are made to work in a way that takes the joy out of it, because it's hierarchical, because it's outcome oriented, and this is not only of academia, this is also part of being a professional in any realm, including filmmaking. You see similar assumptions operating in the film world, including the independent film world at this point, which is that it's about individual achievement. You create a product, you try to get as many prizes as possible, and then hopefully you'll make another one, and it is this type of process. Whereas in this other space, we gave so much more, or the process, we give so much more importance to how we make things, what relationships are produced through the making of that. I think I began, and that's something that Paraíso demonstrates, I began doing films in community.
Makes me feel sad for the rest. Nobody does it half as good as you. Baby, you're the best.
Early acts of creation that you see in the film with your community, with your sister, with your grandmother, and your grandfather, how that form of creativity in a community and that form of learning and teaching is something that is sort of there for you from the very beginning, and I think is there for more people than may be aware of that. And so kind of going into, thinking about pedagogy again, it felt like the process of working in the lab was about sort of returning to and honoring what you already knew and perhaps unlearned somewhere along the way. And I mean, we have these conversations about pedagogy and about the sort of universities, the university valuing a very certain type of learning, and how there are other ways of learning that are not necessarily new or radical, but have actually been practiced forever by many communities that exist, far from the top of these hierarchies.
This period of time that I've been in the academy, because I have been dissatisfied with so much of the ways that learning is organized, and also the very limited epistemological perspectives that people have access to, that I've given a lot of thought to that question. And I became very critical of the way that the university is organized over time and how students are taught and the assumptions that go into that pedagogy. Some of these assumptions are the professor knows, the student doesn't know. So therefore, the project is for the knowledge to flow from source to empty vessel. I think that's a faulty assumption on two counts. One, I think you can teach what you don't know. And what I mean by that is that I think the main purpose of a teacher is to inspire other people to want to learn on their own. So therefore, you don't have to know everything or not even a lot. You just have to be able to be in a position to inspire, and by that just stimulate that people want to know. And it's also faulty because on the student, the assumption that students don't know anything is not accurate. The other part of the lab that's encounter with how academia works more generally is that basically it isolates people. So everybody has to study on their own and be evaluated separately, and on top of that be ranked. So it's a setup that is for isolation, competition, and individual achievement. And that is counter to the ways that humans learn for most of our lives, which is with other people around issues of common concern. So the lab allowed me to create an oasis, if you will, for myself and other people that wanted to work in a collaborative, project-based, applied environment.
Yeah, the you know, in the traditional class environment, I as a student was very aware of the fact that the essay you write or the assignment you complete is not necessarily needed by the professor. It's for you to do for your own benefit if you choose. But the power of feeling that you could use your aptitudes and skills in a way that someone else had need for. And I think that mutual necessity was something that really, really drove me at a time where I wasn't really getting that in other spheres of academics. I think that coming into this new city, into this new space that I wasn't familiar with, you sort of experience a crisis of knowledge and also a crisis of community. Specifically, our film practice and the community that we created around that over the past 4 years was a grounding force.
I associate filmmaking so profoundly with home and community. So for instance, when I migrated and I lived in Philadelphia for 7 years, one of the spaces that made me feel everything's gonna be okay was the 1.5 year retrospective of Latin American cinema that Linda Blackaby organized at International House, where I would go religiously. I went to every single screening, and it was a huge part of my education on Latin American film. But also, I met other people that were also going all the time, and I would run into them, and afterwards we got to know each other, so we would have dinner or we would have a drink afterwards, and that became a whole other school for me and another space to learn and to create other communities in the US. A place where when I migrated, I really didn't know anyone. When I had the opportunity to create community and home within an environment that in many ways I felt at odds with, it would have been film. You know, it is that practice that I have come back to in my life since I'm a kid to this day as a practice of community building and home, with all the tensions and contradictions that we know we have at home.
And I think on my end, sort of witnessing and identifying with the beginning of that in El Paraíso, We were both girls for whom a sense of paradise and a sense of home is very intertwined with filmmaking. And so to see that in somebody else, it's again a very powerful feeling of not being alone.
I think the bottom line about the lab, about filmmaking, about collaboration, about creating non-hierarchical spaces is to say, you are not alone. We are in this together. Which doesn't mean we don't have conflicts or differences, or that at some point someone develops in a different direction. But for that duration, we're not alone and we're doing this together, and that lives with us forever.
I could talk about this for hours, but the sun is setting upon me, and so I believe it's time to say goodbye. But thank you so much for having this conversation with me, and yeah, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing everything of the event, and I'm sorry I can't be there, but I'm there in this way, and I hope to keep the conversation going.